I greet you, brothers and sisters, in the name of Jesus Christ. It is the 19th of April. It's just after 3:30 in the afternoon on this Sabbath day, the last Sabbath of the year. Yes, we're about to go into a new year on what I believe to be the true biblical calendar, the SMS Aries calendar. The sun is entering Aries, and the star speaker is risen in the east, Abib, originally known as Abib. And when we've got that situation, we are now in the month of Abib, when Abib is on the eastern horizon, speaker. The Latin word speaker means grain head, which is the same meaning for the word Abib. So so we're on the 19th. That's the last Sabbath, and tomorrow the 20th is that eclipse that everybody's talking about, the hybrid eclipse, solar eclipse, and that will mark the conjunction of the sun and the moon. So there's no debate as to whether the sun and the moon are in conjunction on that day. And then after that begins the new year. So we'll be looking at start of the year, new moon day on the 21st of April, and the first working day being the 22nd of April, with Passover being on the 4th of May, unleavened bread starting on the 5th of May, and I believe to be a very important date. But today we're going to talk about chronology. We're not going to talk about calendars. I just wanted to show you where we are. And so getting into the chronology, well, this is something that's really, this is more light-hearted stuff. The biblical chronology is really what I regard as something that it's one of the foundation stones of the Bible. It's something that we should all have been taught. Every Christian should understand biblical chronology. Unfortunately, 99.9% of the churches don't even know that there is such a thing as a biblical chronology. They're not even aware of it, which is very, very unfortunate, because without this biblical chronology, we cannot understand one of the most important prophecies in the Bible, and that is Daniel's 70 weeks. So what I want to look at today, and I have mentioned it before in my previous videos on Daniel's 70 weeks, I've touched on it briefly. To some extent I've gone into a little bit more detail how the chronology relates to Daniel's 70 weeks. But today, so this will be a video, it's more along the lines of a book review. I want to just introduce to you something that this book that I discovered about almost 7 years ago, and it's only really in the last 2 years or so where I became more aware of the importance of this chronology, of this discovery. So I'm going to be referring to a book that was written by Rev M Anstey, and was published in 1913. So we have had a biblical chronology understanding of exactly when the events occurred from a biblical perspective. So in other words, we know exactly when the flood occurred. We know exactly the year in which the Exodus occurred. We know exactly when this Daniel received his prophecy of 70 weeks. We know exactly the year in which Jesus was born, baptized, and crucified, all because we've got a biblical chronology. Unfortunately, the majority of the world does not recognize it, is not aware of it, has not picked up on it, and has based its studies on a profane chronology, a worldly chronology, a chronology that does not relate, is not in line, in sync with the biblical chronology. So we've had it for 110 years, and in this 110 years, only a small handful of people actually know about it. So if you watch this video, you'll be amongst that very, very small group that is actually aware of this chronology. So if I can just, I'm hoping that this video will be able to will excite, will get people excited about the accuracy of the biblical dates throughout the Old Testament, and how our Father has provided for us every bit of information that we needed to be able to complete the chronology, all the way from Adam to the birth, baptism, and crucifixion of our Lord Jesus Christ. It's all there. We just had to find it. And this guy, Rev M Anstey, as far as I'm aware, is the only person that has accurately completed the chronology. There have been many others, and he mentions them in detail, but there's always been a slight error here or there, and something missing or something brought in from an external source. And what Reverend Martin Anstey did here was he combined a chronology that's exclusively based on the scriptures. So what I've done is I've taken this there are two parts. This is a PDF of the original book. This is part 1 or volume 1 of the book. This gives the detail of his study, a detailed description of the chronology and how he came to compile it. Volume 2 goes hand in hand with it. This is a set of tables. So volume 2, these are the chronological tables, and what he's done here is he's set up, so from Adam in the year 1, initially it goes up in 10 years, but later on his tables go up year by year. So he's compiled a table with a date. He has the Ptolemaic date in it as well, the BC date, which is a Gregorian based date, and I'm going to show you, and he explains also in his word how this Ptolemaic date is 82 years out. It's 82 years incorrect, but he does put it in as a reference. And so these tables go on later on, these become a year on year. So this is now leading up to the flood. This was just after the flood. The previous table was leading up to the flood. I'm just going to show you that. Okay, so that was no, it was beyond the flood. So the first table goes up to the Exodus. Yeah, up to the Exodus, and then table 2 picks up where the previous table left off, and it's from the Exodus onwards through to, this would include the judges and then eventually the kings, and jumping around a bit here, these are the kings. We have kings for both Israel, Judah and Israel, and then it goes on to the end of the kings would be then there was the Gentile period as well. After the kings were complete, there was this short period where Gentile, the 70 years, and it goes right up to the last bit of chronological data was just after the 70 years of exile into Babylon, when Nehemiah returns to Jerusalem after the 70 years. The biblical chronology goes all the way after the 70 years of exile up to Nehemiah, where he returns. Nehemiah returns to Jerusalem, and that would be 3637 after Adam. The only connection that we have to modern day times is Daniel's 70 weeks, which would have kicked off in the first year of Cyrus. So I think it's just up here. There we go. Cyrus. Yeah, here. So Medes, this was Darius for 2 years, and then Cyrus became sole king, and then we've got the beginning of the 77s, the 490 years, which starts in the first year of Cyrus in the year 3589. Anyway, so then that 490 years takes us all the way through to the baptism of Christ, and working backwards from his age at 30 at baptism, we can determine his birth date, and we can determine his crucifixion date 3.5 years after his baptism. So that's how we've got this chronology all the way through to modern times, and we can complete from that point. We've got the records to be able to complete it to today. So these are these tables. What I did was I imported them into an Excel spreadsheet just to make it a little bit easier and to be able to expand on them. So I just want to show you that. So these are the exact same tables imported into Excel. This document is available on my hard drive. It can be viewed using Google Sheets. I think I've got it open here. So this is the same document using Google Sheets. So you don't need Excel to be able to view it. Google Sheets works just as well. There might be one or two things that are a little bit different, but by and large all the calculations and all that it's all there. I'm just going to use, it's easier for me to use the Excel version. So that's so I just wanted to let you know. I'll provide a link in the description box for those that want to go into the detail. So what I did was each of those tables are brought in. This is the first table, and then I've got the second table that's from volume 2 from Anstey's Romance of Biblical Chronology. I brought them all in, and what I've done is I've been able to expand the number of, I've added columns. So now I've got the actual Gregorian dates, the true Gregorian date against the Ptolemaic date, against Hebrew dates, and then of course all the rest of the information is there as well. So that's just broken up into the various tables. So on this table here we've got the 70 years, the start of the first of the 70 years of exile, when Nebuchadnezzar took Daniel, Shadrach and Meshach and others. Was not everybody was exiled in exactly the same year. There were several groups that were exiled over a period of time, but Daniel was amongst the first group that was taken to Babylon. So that's the beginning of the count of the 70 years of exile, and so there's the end of the 70 years, and this is when Cyrus became sole king. So there's this was Darius the Mede, co-governor with Cyrus for the first 2 years, and then Cyrus became sole king, and that would be the year where the decree was issued as well to rebuild Jerusalem. So that takes us, then you can take the 77s, the 490 years forward, and that's basically what I've done here, is I've just taken that all the way through and this was the time where there was no biblical chronology, but what we know is that we know that on the 483rd year was up to Messiah, and that would have been when Jesus was baptized at age 30. So we can go backwards to his birth date, and he would have been born in 2 BC, and baptized at age 30 in 29 AD. You'll see Anstey had it as 30, but he made there's a common error that most people make in jumping over from BC to AD. You must deduct 1 year. So anyway, I've got the count in here, so there's no count. You can verify the count for yourself. Jesus would have been baptized in 29 AD, and then of course crucifixion would have been around about 3.5 years later in 33 AD, and that would have been the midst of the last 7 of the last week, the midst of the last year. So without biblical chronology, what this is all coming down to, there is no way that we could complete this chronology without the foundation of knowing exactly when the 70 years started and ended, and exactly when Cyrus the king became sole king. And that is the point of contention that has led many people astray, and why so many dates are so screwed up, because they don't have a proper foundation. Anyway, so I've got this imported into Excel. It makes it a little bit easier to edit and maneuver around and to verify the information, and it's just a handy tool. I will make it available. But the foundation, the foundation was Anstey's tables, and then of course his the description that goes along with it. So what I want to do now is just give you a bit of background as to what Anstey actually did, okay? Because this is very important. The first thing we need to understand is that this chronology was entirely based on the Bible, and what I want to just go through is some of the reviews, was just to demonstrate to you what the foundation of the whole book is. So in the foreword of Romance of Biblical Chronology, by Reverend G. Campbell Morgan, he wrote here that and I couldn't put it better myself, so I just want to read through that. He says, Bible study is the study of the Bible, and there are many methods and departments, none without value. All of them, when done thoroughly rather than superficially, tend to the deepening of conviction as to the accuracy of the records. So in other words, the more we get into it and the more thorough we study the word, the more we get into it, and not as opposed to a superficial glancing of it, the more we are convinced of the accuracy of the Bible. And that is exactly what happened here. And unfortunately, many people glance over some of these dates and have missed some of the nuances, and have come unstuck at various points in trying to put a chronology together. But Anstey pressed on, and he goes on to say, to this work Mr. Anstey has given himself with great care and much scholarship. The results of are full of fascination and are almost startling in the revelation of the harmony of the Bible scheme. And the method has been that of independent study of the writings themselves, with an open mind and determination to hide nothing and to explain nothing away. And that was the key. He wasn't prepared to just glance over anything or try to explain it away or try to alter anything when it became a little bit difficult to get through a particular point in establishing the chronology. Instead, he persevered. So the careful and patient student is the only person who will be able to appreciate the value of this work, and all such will come to this study with thankfulness to the author, and I'm certainly one of them, and having mindsets equally open and honest, will be able to verify or correct. In this process, I venture to affirm that the corrections will be few and the verification will be constant, and that is my finding as well. There's just one place where I don't entirely agree with his conclusion, and that's right at the end, and that regards the the 70 weeks, the meaning of the 483rd year versus the conclusion that Martin Anstey came to. And then of course there's one other, the 30 AD should have been 29 AD, but other than that I've not been able to, and I've gone through this in detail, cross-referencing all the scriptures, etc. So I'm really excited to be able to share this with you. I believe it's a solid piece of work that Martin's put together. Just something that Martin himself put, and this is his own preface, and I'd like to just read the two highlighted areas here. The studies embodied in the following pages have been undertaken with a view to ascertaining and exhibiting the exact chronological relation of every dated event recorded in the Old Testament. The object of the writer is the production of a standard chronology which shall accurately represent the exact date at which each event took place, so far as this can be ascertained from the statements contained in the text itself. And that's exactly what he did. He kept it to the text itself and excluded all other sources in determining the biblical chronology. You can read through that section yourself, but I'll just go on to say that chronology, in his own words, is a branch of history. As such, it is governed by the laws that which determine the validity of the result reached by the process of scientific investigation and historical inquiry. It is also a branch of applied mathematics, and mathematics is an exact science. In a truly scientific chronology, there is no room for any date which is not demonstrably true. So the approach that Anstey took to establishing the chronology was that of the scientific approach, being exact and accurate in his determination of each and every date, and in understanding the text that led to that provides each and every date in the chronology of the Bible. And so all credit goes to him. He's been able to do what I would hasten to say nobody else has been able to do, and I'm so thankful for the work that he's done, because he's given me a solid reference. Whenever I study the Bible, I can always go back and determine exactly what date the prophecy was given, what year the event took place, and without any concern for the inaccuracy thereof, knowing that our Father, that date was provided for us by our Father in heaven through his text. Okay, so just pressing on a little bit with the book review, I want to just show you briefly the contents that we're going to work through, just to give you a bit of background. Okay, we're going to touch on very, very briefly the scope, method, and standpoint and sources that he used. Although his source was the Old Testament, it's just a review of some of the other areas where he's done an immense amount of study on all the various sources for comparison and witness purposes only. These sources had zero effect, zero adjustment, but it was really just for comparative purposes. So we'll just have a look at some of those sources of those various texts and literature, etc. Then we'll go into the actual chronology, where it starts off in the pre-flood period, the Adam to Noah period, and then there's a connection to be determined. There's the age of Noah at Shem's birth, and then the next period was from Shem to Abraham. There's also a connection there that had to be discovered. Terah's age at Adam's birth, which is not 70, as most people understand Abraham to be born when Terah was 70. No, he was actually 130 years old when Abraham was born, and that's determined, that's proven in the text. And then of course there's the Hebrew patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And there's another connection to be discovered there, the time between Joseph's death and Moses' birth, a connection in the first section of the biblical chronology. In this video, I don't think we're not gonna get beyond. I just want to get through this first connection, and then I'll make the rest. I'll probably break it up into maybe 3 or maybe 4 videos. I don't know. We'll see how long each video gets to. I don't want to make them too long, but we'll just get into this once we've looked at the introduction. Once we've got past the introduction part of it, we'll get into some of the actual chronology. So in the later videos, we'll look at the theocracy, the Exodus to Samuel section of the chronology, and then after that we'll look at the monarchies. That's the kings. So this is all the judges, and this would be the kings. And then of course there's the Gentile period after, from Cyrus through forward. We're not going to get into a lot of this. Is extra biblical information. I'm more concerned with the Daniel 70 weeks, which makes the connection through to the birth, the year in which Jesus would have been born, according to the Daniel's prophecy, and that will be the conclusion of the review. So that just gives you an idea of where we're going to over the next couple of videos. So without any further ado, I want to get into, we're going to now look into the other texts, some of the other sources that were considered in the process. So other texts, there's a few different, there's about 2 or 3 different ones. So the one I really want to just look at very briefly was the Septuagint. This is that was the earliest, the original translation of the Hebrew text to Greek. So it was pre Jesus' time. So it was in the region around about 250 years before Christ. We'll call it about 200 years before Christ, where the Bible was translated from the Hebrew into the Greek. So Anstey's comment on this, I think, really sums it up, and I'll just read through that it was the work, referring to the Septuagint, that is, work of a number of men who had none of the almost superstitious veneration of the letter for the letter of the Scripture, which characterized the Jewish Palestinian. A Palestinian Jew would never dare to add to or take from or alter a single letter of the original. The translators of the Septuagint, on the contrary, are notorious for their Hellenizing or modernizing tendencies, their desire to simplify and to clear up difficulties, their practice of altering the text in order to remove what they regarded as apparent contradictions, and generally their endeavor to adapt their version to the prevailing notions of the age in such a way as to commend it in the learning and the culture of the time. So in other words, the Septuagint is full of alterations. So it's unsuitable, and there are many dates that they altered as well. And Anstey goes into detail on that, and as to why it's necessary to exclude the Septuagint from a biblical chronology perspective. Okay, there were a few other texts as well, and he goes into detail. I'm not going to go into detail on any of those. The other area is the ancient literature, which remains, in other words, extra biblical text literature which exists, which, as Anstey said, there's really very little information from a chronology perspective. Certainly nothing as accurate and detailed as that which is provided in the Old Testament, all the way from Adam's day. There is no other document, zero, zippo, nothing, that provides the kind of detail from a chronological perspective. So there's not much in any of the other ancient literature. Okay. So I want to get on to, this is a very important section that I want to just touch on, and that is the Ptolemy chronology. Ptolemy was, he lived in 70 to 161 AD, was a great constructive genius according to Anstey. He was the author of the Ptolemaic system of astronomy. That was his main field of study. He was one of the founders of the science of geography, but in chronology he was only a late compiler and a contriver, not an original witness and not a contemporary historian, for he lived in the 2nd century after Christ, and he is the only authority for the chronology of this period. But his work is not corroborated. In other words, there are others like Josephus, etc., that disagree with his chronology. Now, his chronology really comes down to the time period from Cyrus to Alexander the Great. So that's a time of the history where there is great contention as to how long that period was, from Cyrus to Alexander. In other words, the time of the Persian kings. According to Ptolemy and his table that he established, it was a period of 207 years from Cyrus to Alexander the Great. 207 years. So in fact, it would be 205 if you discount the first 2 years where Cyrus and Darius the Mede co-reigned. So this is a table you can find in various other places as well that was published. This is his Julian dates, BC, and so Anstey goes into some detail on that. And I think what we need to understand is where this is where our chronology came apart. This was the stumbling block that caused us to be able to adopt a chronology that was in error, as opposed to the biblical chronology. And I'm just going to take you through what Anstey has to say on the matter. He said in Ptolemy's table of Persian kings, all the Julian years from Xerxes to Alexander the Great inclusive are co-numerary. Therefore each requires to be raised a unit higher to give the Julian years in which their reigns began. Okay, that's just a bit of detail. Right. Ptolemy reckons by the vague Egyptian year of 365. The Julian year is exactly 365 and a quarter days. Now this is the important statement. Had Ptolemy never written profane chronology, in other words non-biblical chronology, profane chronology must have remained to this day in a state of ambiguity and confusion, utterly unintelligible and useless, nor would it have been possible to have ascertained from the writings of the Greeks or from any other sources, except from the scripture itself, the true connection between sacred chronology and profane in any one single instance before the dissolution of the Persian Empire in the first year of Alexander the Great. Okay, so in other words, if it wasn't for Ptolemy, there would be no other way to make a connection between Cyrus's reign and Alexander, that time period. Without Ptolemy, there is nothing else. So as a result, the entire all biblical scholars and modern day chronologists all rely on Ptolemy's dates. He goes on to say, and this is the most important statement of all, Ptolemy had no means of accurately determining the chronology of this period. So he made the best use of material he had and contrived to make a chronology. He was a great astronomer and a great astrologer and a great geographer and a great constructor of systematic systems, but he did not possess sufficient data to enable him to fill the gaps or to fix the dates of the chronology of this period. So he had to resort to the calculation of eclipses. And what has happened now is, because that 207 years, that's 82 years longer than what it should be based on the Bible. So let's just carry on. I'm going to leave this so you can read. I wonder if I should just cover. Let me just read this part as well. In this way, then, not only historical evidence of testimony, but by the method of astronomical calculation and the conjectural identification of records with calculated eclipses, the chronology of this period of the world's history has been fixed by Ptolemy. Since then, through Josephus and Jerome, it has won its way to universal acceptance, and so it is to this day. That that Ptolemy's chronology is universally accepted, and I see that even in, there have been, even in the most very recent past, there have been videos where people have made reference to a specific date and or referred to the understanding of Daniel's 70 weeks and trying to determine the beginning, the decree, because maybe I'm getting ahead of myself now. All right, let's complete this. All right, so we got this situation where Ptolemy has created a period for the Persian kings. Let's read one. There was no other except that given in the prophecies of Daniel. Hence, whilst the Ptolemaic astronomy was overthrown by Copernicus in the 16th century, in other words, Ptolemy made some errors in his calculations, in his astronomical calculations, which were discovered in the 16th century. The reign of the Ptolemaic chronology remains to this day. So in spite of those errors, there is one and only one alternative. The prophecy of Daniel 9 verses 24 to 27 fixes the period between the going forth of the command to return to build Jerusalem in the first year of Cyrus to the cutting off the Messiah in the year AD 30. And that should be AD 29. He made an error when jumping from from BC to AD. As a period of 483 years. Now I believe that 483 years is not to the crucifixion but to the baptism. And that was the only two areas where I disagree with Anstey and his whole chronology, and it does have an impact on the birth and death of Jesus. And we can have a look at that much later on in the review. So if now this is an important. So if this be the true chronology of the period, in other words, Daniel's period of 483 years, then if this be the true chronology of the period from the first year of Cyrus to the crucifixion, it leaves only 123 years instead of 205. You remember it was 207 in the table, but you've got to take off the 2 years of Corex, and then you're left with 205. So instead of 205 given in Ptolemy's canon for the duration of the Persian Empire. So in other words, from Cyrus. So according to Daniel's prophecy, Persian Empire, Cyrus to Alexander the Great, would be 123 years. According to Ptolemy, it's 205, a discrepancy or difference of 82 years. Consequently, the received or Ptolemaic chronology, now universally accepted, must be abridged or adjusted by these 82 years. And that is the state of affairs even today. Right now, people are still using Ptolemy's canon in determining dates concerning these matters. And there's an error of 82 years. So in my table, that's why I have Gregorian dates, and then we've got the Ptolemaic dates. So I've got them both. The Gregorian date would be, you'll see there's always a difference of 82 years between those two dates. Okay, and that's the case right throughout. Just for reference in those tables there. Okay. So that's out of all the various pieces in the introduction and the other sources, and that this is the most important part that I needed to cover. Josephus also had a stab at chronology, and I'll just read what Anstey has to say on the matter. He says Josephus in his present state is a mass of confusion. So, yeah, Josephus from a chronological perspective is not much of a good reference, and we'll just move on. Of course, you guys can go and read. I really want to highly recommend that you spend the time and go through and read this in detail. It makes for very interesting reading in most of the sections. Okay, then the next section is ancient monuments. These are stones and tablets and all these type of things that are, I think, again, Anstey wraps it up pretty nicely. He says the witnesses are extensively and numerous, and when they are correctly or rightly interpreted, they may be regarded as authentic, though of course errors may be engraven upon the rock or written upon the ancient papyrus rolls quite as readily as upon Hebrew manuscripts. So it really comes down to witness. Okay, who's the credible witness in the assessment or the determining of the chronology? Then of course there's classic literature of the Greek and Roman. I'm not going to spend time on this. You can read it. Essentially the beginning period, it was only after Alexander's the Great going forward in the Greek records that we've got proper chronological records of events. Pre that, it's all based on myth and guesswork, and it's subject to a lot of error. So it's not a lot there in it. It makes for a good, interesting read, but I really came to the conclusion, having been through it, that there really is nothing. There's nothing in it. They have no record. They just contrived a whole lot of records to be able to put something on the table. So there's nothing in the Greek and Roman records to help us in the situation. Okay, then astronomical observations and calculations. Again, I just want to refer to Anstey's summary. This section here, as he says, eclipses can be calculated both backwards and forwards. They are distinguished from each other by the time when and the place where they can be seen, the duration of the eclipse, and the quality of the number of digits eclipsed. They have therefore been regarded as a means of correcting and determining the dates of events at which they have occurred, and the results thus obtained have been invested with a kind of quasi-infallibility. The date of our Lord's birth is fixed by means of an eclipse of the moon recorded by Josephus as having occurred shortly before Herod's death. So the problem with these things, yes, although we can calculate the actual occurrence of the event accurately, the problem is identifying which one is the actual eclipse or celestial event that actually matches with the event. And he goes in to describe the eclipse of Thales, where there are 5 different dates given for the same eclipse, or that eclipse we know exactly when it was, but it's associated with different events. So, let me put it to you this way: there were eclipses on each of these dates, and each one of these guys selected a different eclipse to associate with this eclipse of Thales, if that's pronounced correctly. Okay, so it will be seen from the above error, that there are many sources of error which must be allowed for. Therefore, attaching to the chronology result arrived at the infallibility which belongs to the mathematical calculation. Okay, so the calculation is infallible, but selecting the correct one with the actual event is where the errors creep in. So it can cause quite a bit of havoc in chronology. Okay, then there's ancient and modern chronologies, and he covers a tremendous amount of review work on the modern chronologies, going into a fair amount of detail on some of them. Some of those he just touches on. It's quite a bit of reading there. I think that I'm just going to press on from there. Before we get into the actual chronology, there's one last, just understanding the trustworthiness. And this is about the witness. Okay, what's happening here is we are calling other sources as a alternative witness against the Old Testament, the Hebrew Old Testament witness. Okay, so we've got witnesses against each other, and the reader, therefore, or the person that's assessing the evidence put forward by the various sources, needs to be assessed and determined as to which is the credible witness. So that's your choice. I believe that the biblical scriptures are the true witness of these, and so that's basically what he was saying, that the science of history stands upon a different basis from that of the science of nature. In all matters relating to the facts and events of past history, there is one and only one kind of proof possible, and that is not deductive proof, as in mathematics, and it is not inductive proof of the kind which is admissible in natural science, but legal, evidential or historical proof, the kind required in a court of law. So in other words, bringing forth evidence as a witness, as one would in a court of law, and then assessing the witness before you to determine the truth of the matter. And that is the science of it. Alright, so I think that pretty much brings me to the end of the introduction part of the biblical chronology by Anstey. Now I want to get into the real stuff. That's the stuff that's really excites me the most, and that is the actual biblical chronology. Getting into, and this is going to be spread over maybe 2 or 3 videos where we're going to get into the actual scriptures and look at how the Lord has actually provided for us this information, how He's actually given us in all different formats, but nevertheless it's all there. So the first part of it, we're going to just cover the time from Adam to Noah up to the flood. That's the first section. And in Anstey's book, when he starts off this section, he obviously starts in Genesis chapter 1, verses 1. And then he gets into a little bit of a debate outside of chronology, which is a very interesting debate, and that whether this world was created in chapter 1 or whether there was a creation before, whether the actual creation comes later in chapters 2 and 3. And it all comes down to this one word where did the earth become a ruin and a desolation, which implies that there was something already beforehand. It became a ruin and desolation, and now that the creation event described thereafter is actually a restoration event rather than a creation from scratch, and that there was a world before our world. Now, those of us that have been part of Ministry Revealed and Alan's teachings, we will know that we have come to the understanding, based on scriptural evidence, that there were in fact 3 periods, and I'll get into that now. What Anstey, interestingly, argues along the line that there was a pre-world, another that this was a restoration effect, and that's what he really goes into a tremendous amount of detail in this section of the book. The crux of it is that the earth became a ruin and desolation, as opposed to God created a ruin and desolation. So he basically fixed it up, and it's a really interesting section to go and read, get into. It does fall a little bit out of the chronology, because the chronology really starts from Adam. So from the point where Adam was created. So that's where, so in Genesis, so that's where we would start so all chronological dates would be from Adam. Just on that maybe I should just have a look at, on this matter. So for those of us in ministry will be aware, but those that are not, and if you are interested in understanding the detail of this particular aspect, then I'd highly recommend that you watch a video by Alan at Ministry Revealed did. It's called The Beginning, the Light, the Flesh, and it goes into detail how we are now in this, in other words, it's 3 sets of 7,000 years. There was 7,000 years the light creation, 7,000 years, 7,000 years in the beginning, 7,000 years the light creation, and then 7,000 years which is where we are at now, the flesh creation. And Alan goes into a lot of detail on these 3 periods and how it relates to how we can determine that from the scripture before us. So I'd very much, if you want to get into that, and what I'm really saying is Anstey's kind of agreeing that with this, maybe not to the same detail, but that there was a world before the current world that we're in now. So have a look at that if you're interested in getting into some detail on that. There's one other video that he also did, but I think this is the main one. There was one that relates to it, so let me just see if I can find it. It was called It's a Fractal. It's also in here. It's called in that same time period. Let's see if I can find it. Yeah, this one, yeah, It's a Fractal. That was just before. This is the one that was in the beginning, light, and then this one was a little bit earlier, but both of them relate to that subject. Anyway. Okay, so getting back to Anstey's chronology, I think that we can just conclude. What did I want to all right, let's just read his summary of that particular subject. What follows in Genesis 1:3-31 is the story of the restoration of the lost order by the creative word of God between the creation of the heavens and the earth in the beginning, Genesis 1:1, and the catastrophe by which they became a ruin and a desolation, Genesis 1:2. We place those countless ages. In other words, he's saying in that time period between the catastrophe and the where it became a ruin, and Genesis 1:2, where he's now restoring it, he ascribes the countless ages required by geologists for the formation of the various strata of the Earth's crust and the fossil remains embedded therein. Okay, so he's just saying, that pre-world could explain some of the geological evidence that we're seeing on the ground. Okay, I think that's. I want to get into. Okay, this is now we're going to get into. So now he gets into. Okay, so we passed the that sort of introductory phase of 2 possible worlds, but we're in the creation part. But from a chronology perspective, Genesis gives it to us very relatively, well, actually totally straightforward. We've got each father and age at which his son was born and how long he lived for. So you don't have to be a genius to be able to work out exactly when the flood occurred. Okay, so that's all there for us. The flood occurred at exactly 1,656 years after Adam, and you can determine that from the book of Genesis. Very straightforward. The problem comes in later on when we've got some gaps to deal with. So let's just see what Anstey has to say. The design of this genealogy list is to give a chronology of the period from Adam to the flood. The line chosen is the line of Noah, the preserver of the race, the line of the promised Messiah, the redeemer of the race. It must not be assumed that the son named in each generation is either always or generally the oldest son of his father. So this is not stated, and it is not suggested, and is not implied. Certainly, it goes on to say, certainly Seth is not the eldest son of Adam, nor is Shem the eldest son of Noah, though he is mentioned in this list. Genesis 5:32. Before his, so although he's mentioned in this list before his oldest brother Japheth. Moses selects from the genealogical family records only those entries which relate to the chosen people and those other races who are brought into contact with them in the course of their later history. The line of Noah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is selected because to them is given the promise of the seed, in whom all the nations of the earth are to be blessed. The theme of the Old Testament is the Redeemer. All its selections are governed, and all its omissions are explained by this fact. So all the selection of which dates were given, and all the omissions are explained by the fact that the Redeemer, testament of the Redeemer, is the thread, the golden thread throughout the Old Testament. So I think we can go on to okay, so we know when the flood occurred. Now we've got the first connection, and this is really a little bit of an introduction to the actual problem of the connections, of which there are 5. We're certainly not going to have time to go into the detail of all 5, but we're going to deal with the first connection. In other words, what happens is the Bible doesn't give it straightforward. The first, up to the flood and up to Noah, it gives it, the chronology is very straightforward. The problem is that we don't know exactly when, how old Noah was when Shem was born. So we have to, and that's what. So that's the first problem. So, and then there's another problem later on. We don't know how old Terah was when Abraham was born, and we don't know how old. We don't know the time period between Joseph's death and Moses' birth. So these are connections that we have to, through by means of scriptural study and scriptural analysis, we have to bridge these connections. And then, of course, the next one is the connection. There's a period between Joshua to the judges, so where Joshua comes in and the judges take over, and then later on between Eli and Saul. And then the one that's not listed here is, of course, the connection between the end of chronology in the Bible through to the modern day chronology, the time when Jesus, the arrival of our Messiah. So the chronology, the early chronology, I'll just read you from what Anstey has to say. So the early chronology of the Hebrew Scriptures is contained in a series of connected statements, each covering a definite period. Between each of these determined periods, in an apparent chasm or want of connection, a closer and more attentive study reveals the fact that the connecting link between the several periods is always supplied, but it has to be diligently sought for, and that's where a lot of people came unstuck. They didn't diligently seek for those connections, and the 5 apparent chasms at which the continuity of the chronological record appears to be broken off are as follows, and then he lists them. Okay, and I've already covered them. So those are connections that need to be dealt with, and what we're going to do is just have a look now at the first one. Is the Noah. Have I got a link to it? Where is it? Yeah. Okay. So this will be the last section of that we're going to just read. This is the actual connection. Where Anstey goes on to say, we arrive at the age of Noah at Shem, at the birth of Shem, by means of an induction from the facts contained in Genesis 7 verse 6 and Genesis 11 verse 10. From Genesis 7 verse 6, we learn that Noah was 600 years old at the epoch of the flood. From Genesis 11:10, we learn that Shem was 100 years old, 2 years after the flood. Therefore, Shem was 98 years old at the time of the flood. That is, Shem was 98 years old when Noah was 600. Therefore, Shem was born when Noah was 502 years old. So there's our connection now. We've got a date at which Shem, and then later on there are further connections from Shem to his sons, etc., which will conclude, and that will be the next part. He goes on to say, this enables us to connect chronology to the ante-Diluvian patriarchs with the chronology of the post-Diluvian patriarchs, as we may proceed in either of two ways. Okay, in other words, the two ways that we will see later in the next video, how we can move on from Shem, and the chronology moves on to Abraham, and eventually his son Isaac, Jacob, through Joseph to Moses. Well, I kind of stumbled my way through that a little bit. I hope that you found that interesting. I will provide the links to this book, both volume 1 and volume 2, in the description below. I'll also provide a link to the Excel spreadsheet. It'll be uploaded in Excel format, but if you double click on it, it does open up. If you double click on this, well, if you open it up, it should, in fact, so it's in the study Bible. When you open this book, it can be opened in Google Sheets with no problems. And then you can browse through that. You will see this might be a little confusion. I just want to mention it because some might get a little bit stumped. I added another 3 columns on the first page of this file, and that's where I brought in a comparison of Jubilees. The book of Jubilees gives us a whole lot of dates, and I wanted to compare that to the biblical chronology, and what I discovered was that they don't entirely match. They match for the first 5 up to Enoch. Suddenly, when Enoch comes into the picture, there's a 100-year difference between the biblical chronology and that of Jubilees. That increases to around about 355-year difference, and then it gets smaller again, and back to around about at the end, which is Jubilees ends at the Exodus, and then it's so Jubilees ends at the Exodus, and so when you compare the Exodus story and later the entry into the Promised Land, you will find that there's again about 100-year difference between the two. I would suggest that I believe that the Book of Jubilees dates were tampered with. They were altered, and somebody tried to the attempt here. The reason for alteration was they wanted to bring the death of Moses and the entry into the Promised Land at the end of the 50th Jubilee. Exactly. That's how Jubilees describes it, that to the year they entered into the Promised Land at the end of the 50th Jubilee, which is not in line with what the biblical chronology is. And I think that difference is exactly 103 years. In other words, they entered into the Promised Land 103 years after the end of the 50th Jubilee, according to the biblical chronology. And so I think that was the reason for the adjustment that were made, and So that'll be another video some other time if we have time, but it's interesting just to be able to compare the books. I believe that the biblical chronology is the one to work with. It spans a number of books. It spans the details that we will see later on. There's a lot of cross-referencing and a lot of verification and self-evident that where there are multiple ways to arrive at the same date, so which proves that there was no tampering with the dates in the Hebrew text of the Old Testament. So with that, get stuck into biblical chronology, and once you've got a foundation, and you can with this foundation we can understand Daniel's 70 weeks correctly. It's the only way to be able to understand Daniel's 70 weeks if you have the true chronology, because then you know that Cyrus's decree was the trigger. I've covered that before in my previous videos concerning Daniel's 70 weeks, and that's where I'm going to leave it for now. So with that, I'm going to sign out.